Talking with the experts.
Hello, my name is Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com, and welcome to Talking with the Experts, where we talk about all things business by business owners for business owners. And today my guest is Faye Fulton, and Faye lives in the US in South Carolina, and her business is Faye Fulton Speaks. And Faye is the CEO and Chief Storytelling Officer of a boutique consulting firm specialising in one particular area of communication, business storytelling. She is a sought-after keynote speaker who delivers presentations and workshops that inspire professionals to better communicate the value of their company, the value of their products or services, and what they have to personally offer through strategic storytelling. Welcome, Faye.
Rose, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm
Yeah,
delighted to be here.
great. So tell me a little bit more about, I know we were talking a little bit more about it before we went online. So tell me a little bit more about business storytelling and the difference between selling and storytelling.
Well, there are quite a few differences, but I've been very fortunate in my career. My whole career has been based upon communication. But over the last 7 years, I have niched that. So for the last 7 years, the only type of communication that I speak about and I work with my one-on-one consulting clients is business storytelling. It is an incredible communication tool. But most people I run across, and especially when I give a keynote speech, they are very, very confused about business storytelling, about storytelling in general. And I understand that confusion because what has happened in the business arena over the last 5 years, the word story and the word storytelling have become buzzwords in business. And everybody seems to be talking about storytelling. But people do not understand what storytelling actually is. Very few people use it correctly or even impactfully. And, I've thought a lot about this, of course, because this is my area of expertise. I understand the confusion because we think we feel like we're really close to story. And when you hear the word story, most people will think back on their childhood. Most children were put to sleep with their parents reading them a story. But then in my keynote speeches and when I start working with my one-on-one clients, I always ask them, give me the definition of story. And this is how I know so many people are confused, because I might be giving a keynote speech in front of 2,000 people. I'll just throw the question out to the room. And, I have quite a few hands that go up. And invariably, when I ask for the definition of story, this is the answer I get. People will say story. Well, story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, yes, it does, but that doesn't help us understand story in any way. And even a cockroach and Thanksgiving dinner has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So people think they understand story until they try to write one. And then they get into that overwhelmed area. Like, well, I don't even know whose voice I should tell this story in. Yeah, but there's a lot to it. And to be an excellent storyteller, you're going to need to be very good at quite a few skills.
Yeah.
So it is an amazing communication tool, but you have to know how to use it strategically in business.
It's correct. Yeah, I've just finished co-authoring a book, and just to get started was really like the opening paragraph, should, grab the audience's attention. And I think, how am I going to tell this story and make it so that people want to read on further, And so how can someone, make a story out of something that's impactful that people want to read or listen to further?
Well, that's one of the keys of telling a story. You've got to captivate your listeners from the very beginning. And, you're telling a different type of story as an author. People are reading your story and we're telling the story. So it's an oral communication, but the challenge is still there because there is a huge difference between a story, a good story, and a great story.
Mm.
And if you're going to be competitive in today's business world, story has been a buzzword for 5 years. Your story better be an outstanding story because it's exceedingly competitive. And you'll have to keep your readers or your listeners captivated from the very first moment. Well, there's a whole heck of a lot of skills that have to go into that, including vocabulary.
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure about the population of Australia, but I can tell you that most Americans have a very small and poor vocabulary.
Really, it's surprising. That's
people tend to use the same words over and over and over. And one of the things you'll have to do or get very good at is your vocabulary. And what you'll need for a storyteller is a vivid vocabulary.
okay.
Because you're going to have to use precise language and wonderful phrasing to keep those listeners interested. So that's one of the skills that I always recommend people work on. It's not that you need a huge vocabulary, but you need a very vivid vocabulary.
Okay. Can you give an example of maybe something in a business owner could use, like words that, would be vivid in, in copy?
Definitely. And a great question, because most people aren't used to using their words in that way. So here's an example. In my story, I could say, I lost my self-confidence. But I could also phrase it in this way. My self-confidence walked in dusty and moth-eaten. Now, which one do you think is going to be much more interesting to hear? And that's going to get people's attention. So that's what I mean. It doesn't have to be a massive vocabulary, but you better be using a vivid vocabulary.
Yeah.
And personally, I can't think of the last time I've heard anyone out in public use the word moth or mothballs. We know the word, but that's part of the reason you want to use it. Because the brain, now this is fascinating about storytelling, the neuroscience about the brain.
Oh, please do tell, yes.
But the brain is constantly seeking something new. And if you give the brain something new, you're going to be paying attention. And that's why I would always recommend the second way of stating you lost your self-confidence. Moth-eaten. We know exactly what it means, but it's going to catch your attention because it's used so rarely. So that's one of the great little tips about storytelling and the neuroscience. But back to the neuroscience, one of the reasons storytelling is such a powerful communication tool is because stories are co-created. So what I mean is, let me share this with you. What if I shared this with you? She put on her crimson red lipstick, stepped into her black stiletto heels, selected the perfect hat for the occasion, strapped the kids into the back seat of the car, and drove off toward downtown. Now, as I was sharing that with you, you weren't just sitting there listening. As I was sharing that with you, your mind was creating a picture of that woman. You have an image of that woman in your head. And that's what I mean by stories are co-created. Because a story is really like a movie inside of your head. You're going to create that image. And of course, your story will never match my story because my image is completely different from yours.
Yeah, see, mine was she was naked because she had no dress on.
And she jumped into the car with her children. Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, I was going to ask you in your story, what kind of hat did that woman have on?
Black because it matched her stilettos.
Okay. And that's not what I was talking about. So the hat that woman had on was a Christmas hat. She was driving downtown to share the Christmas decorations with her children.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But that is one of the reasons that story is so powerful. They're co-created. So since you're part creator, you've got that image that you create in your mind, you're going to be able to remember the story. And that's another wonderful reason you want to use business storytelling. People remember stories, and there are many reasons for that. Now, before I say anything else, I want to be perfectly clear with you and with every one of your listeners. What I shared with you about the woman, that was not story. It doesn't come close to being story.
No,
Now, yeah, it could develop into story, but it's going to take a heck of a lot of work, because what I shared with you then was a series of events. That's all it was. And simply sharing a series of events, that is not story. But that is, people just call anything a story these days. I'm absolutely taken aback at what people call a story. But they don't have anything near a story. They're simply calling it a story. Well, that adds to the confusion. There's just so much confusion about storytelling. And of course, today we're talking specifically about business storytelling, which is dealt with very differently than simply telling a story for entertainment purposes. And I tell those kind of stories too. But in business, we have to be strategic with our storytelling, and it's handled in a very, very different way than just telling a story for entertainment purposes. But both are very valuable.
Yeah, I read a post on Facebook the other day where a woman intertwined two different scenarios. So one was talking about her business, and she intertwined some personal stuff that was related to the business stuff, but it was written in such a way that you had to read it from start to finish. It was really entertaining, and I'd never seen a post written like that. And she was actually trying to sell something, but you were, glued to the post the whole way through because you wanted to find out at the end of the story the personal part, but you also wanted to find out the business part too and how they related. And it was written so well. And it was a story, but it was a storytelling. It was telling a story of an event, both in her business and in her personal life. And it was so intriguing and just, I don't know, it was lovely. And I wish that some other people could write more engaging posts like that, so we just didn't keep the scroll. I mean, even on LinkedIn and, where they write these articles and, they posts and whatever, they're not really engaging. They're just matter of fact and not, telling a story. They're not doing the business that keeps me engaged, so I'm not scrolling past all the time.
So what you described to me in your mind, that was a great story.
Yeah.
And you're going to remember it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I always assume when my clients work with me one-on-one, they need a story. Like maybe they're making a presentation to their investors or to their team, or they're making a speech, that they are interested in a truly outstanding story. And that's what you're going to have to be competitive today. So that was a story that I would consider it great, the way you described it.
Yeah. I'm doing a speaking course as well, and the CEO of the organization keeps talking about story showing, because he likes to use the hands, and you can use the story to tell stuff and whatever. But they say that during your keynote or whatever talk, you need to intertwine a story into this, so it's got to be something personal so people get to know who you are. But I've never got really the gist of that, so it's I don't know that anything that I have in my personal life could actually equate to anything that I want to talk about in my business. And I'm sure that there must be something, but I can't think of anything.
Rose, don't feel alone. This is how most professionals start with me. Like their team or their bosses told them, you need to tell a story. You need a business story. And they're thinking, I don't have any stories. My life isn't really interesting. I don't have story. Well, of course, we all have stories. But I understand that perspective, because to you, it was just life. You lived through it. but
Mm.
actually you could develop it into a very good story. But you're going to have a lot of skills to do that. You have to know, like anything else, you have to learn what to do. But that's one of the things that I offer. We first have to find a story. And most people come to me, I don't have any stories. Like, yes, you do, but we're going to have to find, So I have exercises I take my clients through, to stimulate the gray matter, because I'm not going to work with anyone who doesn't tell a true story. It
Mm.
has to be a true story, or I'm not going to work with you, because we're not making up stories.
Mm.
But I don't know why you would ever want to. It's your reputation on the line. You're up there telling the story. So, but I have had several clients say, I'm going to make up a story. And I have to refuse. I
Mm.
won't be a part of that. And that's not storytelling.
No.
But again, just so many people are confused, and I love the confusion. I have so many very high level executives, and they need a story, and they come, and the first thing they say is, I don't want to tell a story. Story is simply fluff. I want to share all my numbers and my statistics and how we've grown. And I have to start educating them right out of the gate. But I love that, because I always see the light bulb go off. Once you get the knowledge, you start understanding. So I very often have to say, look, story is much more important than your numbers and your figures, because those numbers and those figures are only going to be understood through context. And your story is the context that will allow your listeners or your audience to understand.
There's
And I
nothing
always, I'm like, oh my God, you're right. I mean, the numbers make sense to you. You've lived with them for 20 years. You've had your business 20 years, but we're going to have the context.
Yeah, I agree.
So I
nothing worse.
usually share that pretty early on, and they start to realize, oh my gosh, well, that's what I offer as a business storytelling consultant. This is my skill set. You have an MBA, you know how to run a business, you know how to crunch the numbers. That stuff is boring to me.
Yeah,
But
me
I
too.
can, oh my gosh, yeah, please. But I can help you with my skill set, so
Yeah.
I love working on a team. That's what makes a great team. We all contribute something different.
Okay, so what are the 5 types of stories that professionals need to tell, and what skills do storytellers must have to be strong in business storytelling?
Well, let's start with the different types of stories. Um, but before we do, can I back up a little bit and tell you why I am so passionate about storytelling?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Because I love sharing this.
Good.
I I kind of feel now at this stage in my life, I've come full circle, which is another reason I get real excited about this. But I had a marvelous childhood, and I wouldn't trade my childhood with anyone else's. I grew up in Italy. I know. It was fabulous. I loved it. So I moved to Italy when I was 5 and a half. So that's really when I started my life. Before that, you're in your home with your parents, you're learning the language and everything else. So I really feel like I started my life in Italy. My father was a big corporate muckety muck, and he got this fabulous promotion. And that's why we moved to Italy. He worked for Texaco, and he headed the marine department for the European division of Texaco. So of course we moved to Italy. But back then, the Italy back then is so different than the Italy of today. And we moved to Palermo,
Yeah, I've
the
heard of that.
world
Yeah.
capital of the mafia.
Yes.
Yes. And back then, the mafia was in our face. It's not that way today. And also back then, there were very, very, very few Americans living in Italy, and nobody in Europe spoke English. Everybody in Europe started learning English in the 70s when the American sitcoms were played on TV. So that was before, because I grew up in the 60s. So we had to learn their language. So I loved it. I was a huge tomboy, and I was always outside. And of course, like all European big cities, most of the people live in high-rise apartment buildings. Well, we did too. We had the top floor, but on the third floor of my building lived a contessa, and she was also a retired opera singer. She was a famous European opera singer. But when I met her, she was approaching 70 at a gallop. She was retired. And after she retired, she acquired that disease called agoraphobia, where you can't leave your home. So very often she was out on her balcony, but she never left her apartment. So that's how I met her. Suddenly there's an American girl, one American girl in the neighborhood, and everybody was talking about me. So she called me over one day and then invited me up, and we just developed this very close, very special relationship. She never had children of her own, but she treated me like I was her daughter. And she's the one who introduced me to storytelling. Because she never left her apartment, all of her friends came to visit her. Well, all of her friends were performers, famous people, musicians, dancers, choreographers, singers. They were her friends. And these people were incredible storytellers. So I would sit in her home and I was listening to stories from people who spoke all sorts of different languages, from people from all different countries with all types of backgrounds. And I cannot even imagine a better start to my life.
Wow, that's
It
exciting.
was a wow. So I got interested really early on. But then when we were living in Palermo, my father would save up his vacation every other year. So we'd go on vacation every other year and we'd have the whole summer. And we would come back to this United States and we would visit my grandparents. Well, my grandfather, who lived in Texas, was a storyteller. And no one had ever told me. And, you know, he met me he spent a lot of time with me when I was an infant, but I was almost 8 years old before I ever met him. So to my remembrance, you know. So I meet this man and he's a storyteller. So at that time, my grandfather was retired, but all day long, he walked around with a spiral notebook, the kind that has the spiral at the top. And he had that notebook with him constantly because he was writing stories all day long. But his stories were really different than the stories I heard in Italy because his stories had to rhyme. And we never even talked about rhyme in Italy. So my grandfather and I spent hours every day coming up with words that would rhyme for his story. And at the end of the day, after we ate dinner, we were still around the dining table. My grandfather would read us his story he wrote that day. And they were usually hilarious, just excellent storyteller. So I had this Italian start, and then my grandfather, who was so creative and imaginative. And it was just fab. I was hooked from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah. What a great childhood. My goodness.
And then, of course, as I share with you, I spent my whole career working in communications. But now I've niched. So that's what I meant. I feel like I'm full circle now. I started with story, and now all I'm working with is story. But now I'm a story expert. And it's been a fabulous journey.
Oh, sounds wonderful.
So I love to share that. And one of the things that I love is language. You know, I speak 3 languages. Well, I started really early, and language is fascinating. Okay.
Okay, so we'll go back to the 5 types of stories that professionals need to use.
Yes, let's talk about the business professional. All right, so there are 5 types of stories to tell in the business arena. So the first story is what I call the origin story. And what I mean by the origin story, it's the origin of your business or your career. So in other words, why did you choose to work in the industry you're working inside of? So that is the origin story. And that's going to help people get to know you, get to realize that you and your organization is worth doing business with. So origin stories are very, very important to share. Now, the second type of story to share today is what I call a beginning story. And what I mean by a beginning story is the stories of your childhood, when you learned all of those life lessons as a child, because those life lessons have made you the person you are today. So, for example, you could tell a story about playing baseball you and your brother, and your brother hits the ball and it crashes through the neighbor's window and breaks the window. But everybody on the baseball field leaves, but you're the one kid who went over, picked up the ball, went over to the neighbor, knocked on the door and said, "I'm sorry we broke your window and I will pay for it." Well, that's a great story to share what kind of person you are. And that's what I mean by beginning stories. All right, the third type of story business professionals want to be telling is what I call inspiring stories. And these are stories to rally your team around you. Because people today, they want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And they also want to know that they have purpose, that they have meaning, and that they contribute. There's a reason they're there. So the inspiring stories, they're really for your team, the people you surround yourself by. And again, when you think of business storytelling as a communication tool, how well do you know your teammates? Well, by sharing their beginning stories and their origin stories, you can really start to understand what they bring to the table, and you'll realize what kind of person they are. All right, so that was the third one. The fourth story to be telling today is a value story. Now, with value stories, what I mean is you're going to be telling stories about your product or your service, but you're not telling a story to sell your product or your service. That's not the way you want to work with story. With a value story, you're telling a story about a person who has been changed or their life has been improved because of your service or your product. So you're not talking about how fabulous your perfume is and the ingredients that go into the perfume. You're talking about, it's a story about how that perfume impacted that person's life. And that's very, very different than trying to sell with a story. All right, so that was the fourth one. And the fifth story to be telling in today's business world is the customer story. And of course, this is a story you don't tell, your customer tells it. But once again, it's going to be a story the customer tells about the product or the service and the way that that product or service has helped them or improved their life. But those are the 5 types of stories you want to be engaged in business today.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, and it's a perfect line to to build up the storytelling, I guess. I understand and a lot of people miss out on heaps of those steps. They don't engage with their teammates, they don't tell stories about themselves, and they don't get the teammates to tell stories about themselves. So there's a lot of communication breakdown, I guess, and nobody really knows who anybody is. They just go around and round and round and nothing happens, and then if something goes astray, they don't know why. So if someone all of a sudden breaks down and has a meltdown and loses their temper, they don't know that this person's got other stuff happening in the background because they don't know who that person is, and that's really hard.
Well, another reason that business storytelling is so valuable is because people do business with people they know, like, and trust.
Perfect. Yes.
And if you're telling your stories, these types of stories we just went over, that potential client or customer is going to start to understand what type of person you are. Are you someone who's going to keep your word? Are you going to do what you say you're going to do? Are you trustworthy? Are you honest? Because no one's going to believe you if you say, "Oh, I'm honest." Now if Martha said Faye is very honest, now you're going to believe that. But that's another reason stories are so valuable. You can communicate that honesty, but you're not going to come right out and say, "Look, I am the most honest person you've ever met." No, you're going to tell a story that makes the listener realize, "Oh my gosh, Faye is really honest."
Yeah, it's not a resume, is it? It's not a CV. It's a business. Yeah.
No. Yeah, and back to the people who say, "Okay, story is nothing but fluff." They don't understand story. I want to share all my numbers, my statistics, my sales figures. Well, do those numbers and statistics make you more believable or more trustworthy? No, they don't.
No, it's
But
just
what will make you more believable and trustworthy is sharing stories.
yes, how those numbers came to be and those statistics and how you achieve them. Yeah, I get it. It's and I'm hoping that other people get it too, because it's a great way to run your business. It really is, and people need to, I guess, realize that they can't just keep going and saying that they're trustworthy, they're believable, they're whatever. They need to actually do stories, and they need to story tell. So yeah, I do. I understand it perfectly. And I really thank you for sharing your information today. Faye, where can people find you?
Well, I am definitely out there. As a speaker, I'm a public figure. So one of the ways you can contact me is going to my website, which is simply www.fayefulton.com. And that's FAYEFULTON.com, my name. You can also find me on Instagram. And on Instagram, it's at Faye Fulton _speaker. And just a little tidbit, because I share an awful lot of information about storytelling on Instagram. But every Tuesday, I share a vocabulary word. And why it's valuable is it's a great storytelling technique. So what I'm sharing with you is every Tuesday, I share my definition of the word. You'll never find the definition in a dictionary.
Okay.
And the storytelling technique is sometimes in your story, it's going to be much more powerful for you to share your definition instead of the actual word. And sometimes it's a way to add some humor, sharing your definition.
Yep.
So if people follow me on Instagram, that's something that I love helping people with, vocabulary. So that's every Tuesday.
Oh, I'm going to definitely go and follow you now.
Well, that would be great. And then you can always find me on LinkedIn, which of course is linkedin.com/in/Faye Fulton.
Yeah.
So you get on LinkedIn and key in my name and I'll come up.
Yeah. All
I'll
those
come up.
details will be posted um, underneath the description on YouTube and on SoundCloud and all the other platforms that I post to. So thank you so much, Faye, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I've really learned a lot about the difference between telling a story and storytelling. So it's been fabulous. Thank you so much. And I hope you will join me again and we can have a further discussion about storytelling and stories. It'll be great.
That would be wonderful. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thanks, Faye.